folks. Thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of the Federalist Files. We'll be covering Federalist number 54 today. It is titled The Apportionment of Members Among the States, written by James Madison, February 12th, 1788. Topics include the Three-Fifths Compromise, Electoral College Introduction, taxation and representation to be evaluated on the same grounds to safeguard from inflation to numbers. It's kind of confusing. So this one, in a general sense, it confronts the apportionment as in per how many people per representative. It also confronts and addresses the issue of whether they counted slaves as part of those numbers, and they were calling them at this time inhabitants. And it was weird. The South wanted them to be counted, but didn't want them to be counted as property. If they were counted as property, that would increase the taxation in the South. So that's why they called this the Three-Fifths Compromise. So what the South wanted is they wanted every single slave to be counted as an inhabitant, because that would give them more power in terms of federal legislative power, in terms of members in the House of Representatives. It is, for example, it's actually very similar to what's going on today in a way. Illegal aliens, the idea of having them count on the census is because then when you go to gerrymander or redistrict, those individuals are counted. So if you in a district have, I think it's 600,000 representatives now to every single House of Rep member. I think that's the number. Not 100% sure, but if you have 400,000 people in one district and there's 200,000 illegal aliens, that district still, if you have 200,000 people that don't count as citizens and aren't going to vote, it still counts as one House of Rep member. So you end up getting more and more members through a system like that. So what the South wanted is they wanted that idea. They wanted each inhabitant to be counted as one person. I'm not exactly sure how. I don't think there was voting rights at this time for slaves. So the Three-Fifths Compromise was to count every 5 slaves as 3 people. I think it was the point of it. I don't know exactly in terms of voting if they actually counted in terms of vote. I'm not exactly sure at this time how that worked exactly. Maybe I can look it up real quick. And the reason for this was the South wanted more legislators. So it was a compromise reached among state delegates during the 1787 due to dispute over how slaves would be counted. So this I didn't even think, and this was because of the number of seats and then additionally how much you would have to pay in taxes. So they counted that towards the purpose of apportioning. They didn't even count that towards the purpose of actually voting. And the third, more electoral votes than if slaves had been ignored, but fewer than if slaves had been counted equally with free citizens. And the reason for this is so you had the North that knew if each slave was counted as an inhabitant, it would give the South much more legislative power. Some of these bigger states would have way more power than some of these smaller states, or it would throw the power out of whack, the power dynamic, the federal power dynamic, because you would give the southern states way more federal legislative power. So they came up with the idea of this compromise, 3/5. And additionally, on top of that, the reason for that was to also save taxes in the South, because they were trying to figure out a system for taxation, and they were trying to figure out by each inhabitant in the individual states, that's how much is to be given from those states to the federal government. It's based solely, they were trying to base it solely on population. And this paper, it'll get into it. I'm going to get into it as I read. So it starts off with Madison addressing the issue on the amount of representation that is to be apportioned to each state as being dependent on the population. So he starts off, and I quote, "The next view which I shall take of the House of Representatives relates to the appointment of its members to the several states, which is to be determined by the same rule with that of direct taxes. It is not contended that the number of people in each state ought not to be the standard for regulating the proportion of those who are to represent the people of each state. The establishment of the same rule for the appointment of taxes will probably be as little contested. though the rule itself in this case is by no means founded on the same principle. In the former case, the rule is understood to refer to the personal rights of the people with which it has a natural and universal connection." End quote. So they're saying the apportionment, how many representatives of the House that you get to your state, is all based on population. That's the way he explains it. And then they're talking about a direct taxation as well. He says that may also be through population, but not for the same reason. For the very first reason, it's because that is the personal rights of the people, and they're still trying to kind of figure out the direct taxation. So he goes on. States next, in the latter, it has reference to the proportion of wealth, of which it is in no case a precise measure, and in ordinary cases a very unfit one. But notwithstanding the imperfection of the rule is applied to the relative wealth and contributions of the states, it is evidently the least objectionable among the practicable rules, and had too recently obtained the general sanction of America not to have found a ready preference with the convention, end quote. So it says this one's still up for debate. We're still trying to figure it out. We're trying to look at it in terms of the proportion of the wealth of the state. So if you, let's say you have these 13 colonies or these 13 states, and New Jersey has, one of the best economies, and New Jersey's economies in terms of GDP every single year, their economy makes up about 25% of the union. Then they would be taxed accordingly in proportion to that. Maybe the proportion would be some sort of percentage. Let's say it was a 3% direct taxation on each state individually, so it wouldn't be based on how many people you have in population or really exactly how much wealth you had. It'd be much more reliant on a percentage base, a flat tax, in other words, which I personally think is the fairest way to do taxation. I think that's the way that income tax should work to begin. If we're going to have income tax, I'm not a huge fan of even having the income tax, considering it was banned from the Constitution in the very originating document until they passed the 16th Amendment in, I think it was 1914 or 1913, to make direct taxation or income tax legal. Probably one of the worst decisions that we've ever made as a country. But if you're going to do it, it should just be a flat rate tax. And I think that's what he's kind of going towards. But that's not really the point of this paper as much. It's much more about the 3/5 compromise. And at this point, when he writes this, he talks about 2/5 instead of 3/5. Obviously, they end up compromising on the compromise and they make it 3/5. But I'm going to go forward here. So he states next, and I quote, "All this is admitted, it will perhaps be said, but does it follow from an admission of numbers for the measure of representation, or of slaves combined with free citizens as a ratio of taxation, that slaves ought to be included in the numerical rule of representation? Slaves are considered as property, not as persons. They ought therefore to be comprehended in estimates of taxation which are founded on property, and to be excluded from representation which is regulated by a census of persons," end quote. So this is the way that the South was, the South, and this is Madison at this time, was pretty, I think he had a couple of slaves, but he was much more of a humane slave owner, I think. Hamilton did not have any. But Madison was pretty opposed to it, even though he had some, which I find it's very odd, but he's much more humane about his ownership. I believe upon his death, they were freed. They lived in very good conditions relative to the time, comparatively to other slaves. There are degrees and magnitudes to being a slave owner at that time. There were people that treated their slaves very badly, and then there were some that treated them much better. I think Madison, I believe his slaves slept in the same house as him. They eat like the same meals as him, from what I've read. So it goes on. Additionally, taxation in terms of property will be apportioned as dependent on the value of that property. Thus, different states will have differences in taxation depending on individual property wealth. Also, Madison condemns the egregious reprehensible actions that have been taken upon the slaves. So we're going to start going into that a little bit as well. And what he's doing is he is characterizing the arguments of his dissenters, of the Southern slave owners, and he goes on to kind of explain their argument and then his counter-argument to them. So he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "This is the objection, as I understand it, stated in its full force. I shall be equally candid in stating the reasoning which may be offered on the opposite side. We subscribe to the doctrine. Might one of our Southern brethren observe," and this is what the Southern brethren, as in the slave owner, would say, and I quote, that representation relates more immediately to persons and taxation more immediately to property, and we join in the application of this distinction to the case of our slaves. But we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property, and in no respect whatever as persons. The true state of the case is that they partake of both these qualities, being considered by our laws in some respects as persons and in other respects as property, end quote. Which I think is very interesting. Or maybe that was so that is his debate back to the Southern Brethren saying, we subscribe to the doctrine, which I don't know exactly what that means, but that's his response is, okay, so if you guys want to count these people as people, you can't have it both ways. You can't count them in your legislative power and then act like they're not property and don't have to pay taxation on them. That's his point. So he continues on this. He states next, and I quote, in being compelled to labor not for himself but for a master, in being vendible by one master to another master, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the capricious will of another, the slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. In being protected, on the other hand, in his life and in his limbs, against the violence of all others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, and in being punishable himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of the society, not as a part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, not as a mere article of property, end quote. So it's very interesting. What he's trying to say, I think what Madison this entire time is saying, okay, so you guys can't have it both ways. You cannot say that, and at the South, well, like I said before, the South wanted the 3/5. They actually wanted each one of their slaves to be counted as a inhabitant, so they can get more legislative power. But at the same time, they did not treat their slaves that way, like they were inhabitants or like they were free citizens. They treated them as property. So what Madison's response is really his answer is, we should not count these people as citizens because you guys are not treating them as such. If you want them to be counted as citizens, you guys are going to have to release them and make them free citizens to do so. And this was the debate. In the South, they actually, but they didn't want, at the same time, they didn't want to call them property either, because the South then knew they would get more taxation that they would have to pay. So that's why they came up with this 3/5 compromise. They counted 3/5 to please the Southerners, and then they counted 3/5 also to please the Northerners, because there would be a tax on those 3/5 as well. That's the point of this. It was an attempt to try to phase out or deter slavery, and that was the point of 1812, having a heavy taxation on every single imported slave from another country. That's the point of all of this. So he goes on. He states next, and I quote, "The federal Constitution therefore decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property. This is in fact their true character. It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live, and it will not be denied that these are the proper criterion, because it is only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Negroes into subjects of property, that a place is disputed them in the computation of numbers, and it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants," end quote. So, and once again, this is him saying, if the Southerners really want to count every single slave as a citizen, then they need to free them instantly. They need to do it right now at this point, if that's what they want. But under the position that they're in, you can't say that they're a free citizen and they count as a inhabitant of the country and then expect them and then not treat them as such, because you want to dodge taxation and you want more legislative power. So he goes on next, he states, and I quote, "This question may be placed in another light. It is agreed on all sides that numbers are the best scale of wealth and taxation, as they are the only proper scale of representation. Would the convention have been impartial or consistent if they had rejected the slaves from the list of inhabitants when the shares of representation were to be calculated and inserted them on the lists when the tariff of contribution was to be adjusted? Could it be reasonably expected that the Southern states would concur in a system which considered their slaves in some degree as men when burdens were to be imposed, but refused to consider them in the same light when advantages were to be conferred?" End quote. So he's just calling out their hypocrisy. He's saying, these people they're playing games. They think that they deserve more legislative power, but they don't want to treat their slaves as free citizens, and they want to gain that power through these really illicit means. And but at the same time, they also don't want to be taxed. So they don't want to grant them. They want them like in the middle area where they can really dehumanize them as much as possible. In this case, and that was the case. The North did not agree, even at the inception of this country, the North did not agree with slavery. So this critical race theory, this 1619 project, trying to characterize all the founders and all the very beginning of America, the way in which it was created and founded, it is false. It's categorically false. The North did not want slavery, whereas the South did. And they ended up paying for that in the South because the North, because it was a much more free market, they were much more efficient. They did a better job, and they became much more economically powerful than these southern states. And then, like the Civil War that happened, transpired, and the South lost. Simply, the South lost because of economics. In terms of leadership, Grant was a way worse general than who's the Southern? I'm trying to think of the Confederate. Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a way better general. He was leaps and bounds above Ulysses Grant if you ever read historically. The reason he lost had nothing to do with his lack of prowess on the battlefield, his ability to lead. The reason he lost was simply economical reasons, and the amount of the population just didn't add up. They didn't have the money to do what they needed to do, and the North won. Thank God. But he goes on here. States next, and I quote, "Might not some surprise also be expressed that those who reproach the Southern states with the barbarous policy of considering as property a part of their human brethren should themselves contend that the government to which all the states are to be parties ought to consider this unfortunate race more completely in the unnatural light of property than the very laws of which they complain." And then he quotes here, I don't know if this is him or another person. "It may be replied, perhaps, that slaves are not included in the estimate of representatives in any of the states possessing them. They neither vote themselves nor increase the votes of their masters. Upon what principle, then, ought they to be taken into the federal estimate of representation? In rejecting them altogether, the Constitution would, in this respect, have followed the very laws which have been appealed to as the proper guide." End quote. So what he's saying is in these individual states, they don't even recognize slaves as citizens. They don't recognize them as inhabitants. They recognize them as property. They're not able to vote. So, and just to point out the condemnation that James Madison pushes on the southern states for the policies that they hold in these terms. The fact that once again, you treat them like they're property and you're not treating them like they're citizens, you can't have it both ways. This is what he's saying. He goes on. He states next, and I quote, "This objection is repelled by a single observation. It is a fundamental principle of the proposed Constitution that as the aggregate number of representatives allotted to the several states is to be determined by a federal rule founded on the aggregate number of inhabitants, so the right of choosing this allotted number in each state is to be exercised by such part of the inhabitants as the state itself may designate. The qualifications on which the right of suffrage depend are not perhaps the same in any two states. In some of the states, the difference is very material. In every state, a certain proportion of inhabitants are deprived of this right by the constitution of the state, who will be included in the census by which the federal constitution apportions the representatives." End quote. So he's saying each individual state has its own rules for voting, its own rules for apportionment in their own legislative branches of the states. But in this particular instance, this is the federal constitution. These are the federal rules on what is to be considered an inhabitant and what is to be counted by the census, which is the way that we currently do it now. These sanctuary cities are actually in direct violation of the Constitution because of this. Because you cannot have an apportionment. You can't be counting people that are not citizens of the United States and are not even here on work visas. They're illegal aliens. You cannot count them in the census because constitutionally they should not count. There is no legal legislative power because those representatives do not represent illegal aliens in the country. So he goes on next. He states, and I quote, "In this point of view, the Southern states might retort the complaint by insisting that the principle laid down by the convention required that no regard should be had to the policy of particular states towards their own inhabitants, and consequently that the slaves as inhabitants should have been admitted into the census according to their full number in like manner with other inhabitants, who by the policy of other states are not admitted to all the rights of citizens. A rigorous adherence, however, to this principle is waived by those who would be gainers by it. All that they ask is that equal moderation be shown on the other side. Let the case of the slaves be considered, as it is in truth a peculiar one. Let the compromising expedient of the Constitution be mutually adopted, which regards them as inhabitants, but as debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as divested of 2/5 of the man." So he's talking about, and it's, I guess, in this point of view, the Southern states might retort the complaint by insisting that the principle laid down in the convention required that no regard should be had. Yeah, so what the Southern states are trying to push is that the states themselves have the right to classify what is an inhabitant, what is a citizen, what is a slave, and what their value is, which just is not the truth. That's not the case. The federal government is to do that. The federal government is in charge of the legalization process of citizenry. And what this compromise, and he refers to it, the 2/5 of a man. And I guess in the very beginning, when they were debating the Constitution, that's what they were going with. It was going to be 2/5. It ends up being 3/5. 3/5 compromise is what they call it. So Madison, he admits that he compromised with the South in order to gain an acceptance vote in favor of the Constitution. Owners were taxed on those slaves, and slaves were given 3/5 of a vote. Not 3/5 of a vote, but rather 3/5 of representation. I don't even think they were counted in terms of voting. There was 3/5 of representation in the legislative branch. The commingling of the topic of slave suffrage, along with the method by which representatives would be apportioned, is due to the dependence on population. Southern slave owners wanted an increase in population in order to gain more representation. They wanted slaves to count towards representation. The taxation of these slaves and the eventual constitutional taxation on importation of slaves in 1812 by Madison was a sanguine action to try and rid America of this grotesque form of servitude. So he goes on, he talks about a compromise, I believe, next in this quote. So next he states, and he states a couple of rhetorical questions. He says, and I quote, "After all, may not another ground be taken on which this article of the Constitution will admit of a still more ready defense? We have hitherto proceeded on the idea that representation related to persons only, and not at all to property. But is it a just idea? Government is instituted no less for protection of the property than of the persons of individuals. The one as well as the other, therefore, may be considered as represented by those who are charged with the government," end quote. So he's saying the federal government, the point of the government, is not only to protect property, but also, and more importantly, it is to protect the people themselves. And he says, is this just? Is this justification, the idea that these slaves are considered 3/5 in the legislative power, 3/5 of the population? Is this just? We're meant to be here. The frame of the government is to protect the individual and protect the property at the same time. We're not doing either one in this case. So furthermore, whichever side a citizen fell on the government were representation for slaves as well. He detailed that in the federal government, and I quote, "Upon this principle it is that in several of the states, and particularly in the state of New York, one branch of the government is intended more especially to be the guardian of property, and is accordingly elected by that part of the society which is most interested in this object of government. In the federal constitution, this policy does not prevail. The rights of property are committed into the same hands with the personal rights as well." So he states that, and that's just what I mentioned before. So Madison, in this paper, he also establishes the concept behind the Electoral College, giving states, no matter what the wealth, influence, or population, the same power in proportion to other states in terms of population and representation for federal elections. So it does not have anything to do with how much money your country brings through in the budget every single year, how much the monetary value of or the GDP of your state. None of that matters. What matters is the population and the citizens. So he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "States have not, like individuals, an influence over each other arising from superior advantages of fortune. If the law allows an opulent citizen but a single vote in the choice of his representative, the respect and consequence which he derives from his fortunate situation very frequently guide the votes of others to the objects of his choice, and through the imperceptible channel the rights of property are conveyed into the public representation. A state possesses no such influence over other states. It is not probable that the richest state in the Confederacy will ever influence the choice of a single representative in any other state," end quote. So he's saying even the most opulent, even the most rich dude, when he goes to vote, his vote's going to count as one. All free citizens, they should all count as one. And there's going to be people that, from the rich guy, when he goes to vote, people are going to follow the rich dude. So yes, they will have some sort of power and influence in a way. But he will have no influence in terms of representatives of other states, or this person only casts one vote. So we see this today. We see this today in the celebrity class. The celebrity class, they hold a lot of money, they have a lot of capital. They're the ones attempting to influence politics, which is something that is somewhat frowned upon to a way, but you give people the free choice to listen to these celebrities, and that's the point of the whole thing. It all makes sense. It is all what a free country is supposed to be. What you do is you count on the citizenry to be smart enough to not listen or to always question what the celebrity class says, which we don't see today go on very often. So next he states, and I quote, "The new Constitution is, in this respect, materially different from the existing Confederation as well as from that of the United Netherlands and other similar confederacies. In each of the latter, the efficacy of the federal resolutions depends on the subsequent and voluntary resolutions of the states composing the Union. Hence the states, though possessing an unequal vote, an equal vote in the public councils, have an unequal influence corresponding with the unequal importance of these subsequent and voluntary resolutions. Under the proposed Constitution, the federal acts will take effect without the necessary intervention of the individual states," end quote. So he says it's different from in respect to the United Netherlands. He says in each of the latter, and he's talking about the United Netherlands and other confederacies, the voluntary resolutions of the states composing an equal vote in the public councils have an unequal influence. So he's saying some states in these other confederacies had more power than other states. In this case, the states will have all the equal amount of power, not equity, but they will have the equal amount of power. They will all play by the same guidelines and the same rules for each individual state. So many citizens were to each representative. I think at this time I want to say it was maybe 30,000. 30,000 for every single representative. I think that was the number at this time. So all the rules, all the states play by the same rules. This is considered equal, not equitable. So not every single state we're going to have the same amount of representatives, but every single state played by the same rule, the same uniform rules. So next he goes on, and I quote, "They will depend merely on the majority of votes in the federal legislature, and consequently each vote, whether proceeding from a large or smaller state, or a state more or less wealthy or powerful, will have an equal weight and efficacy in the same manner as the votes individually given in a state legislature by the representatives of unequal counties and or other districts have each a precise equality of value and effect, or if there be any difference in the case, it proceeds from the difference in the personal character of the individual representative rather than from any regard to the extent of the district from which he comes," end quote. So he's just accentuating this. The example that I played out before, where you have these sanctuary cities and you have these people in specific states, you have these different districts that play by totally different rules. So you have people taking advantage of illegal aliens being here and adding them to the census and adding more legislative power to districts that don't deserve that legislative power. So now we have specific districts. For example, in New Jersey, I think it's District 12 in New Jersey that some of these sanctuary cities lie under, they have more legislative power than a district in Missouri, if Missouri does not have those same sanctuary city laws. So we have specific states that are not playing by the rules, and this is now considered an unequal system. So under the Constitution, there was not to be an unequal system. That was the whole plan of this whole thing. So in conclusion, and this is the very last quote I have, in conclusion, Madison states that by putting representation and taxation in the same method of evaluation, it deters those who would try to inflate population numbers for hopes of more representative power, because this would further raise taxation. So next he states, and I quote, "In one respect, the establishment of a common measure for representation and taxation will have a very salutary effect, as the accuracy of the census to be obtained by the Congress will necessarily depend in a considerable degree on the disposition, if not on the cooperation of the states. It is of great importance that the states should feel as little bias as possible to swell or to reduce the amount of their numbers, were their share of representation alone to be governed by this rule. They would have an interest in exaggerating their inhabitants. Were the rule to decide their share of taxation alone, a contrary temptation would prevail. By extending the rule of both objects, the states will have opposite interests which will control and balance each other and produce the requisite impartiality." End quote. So he says, more importantly, if we go by this rule, if we go with population to determine how much taxation is to be held, or how much taxation is to be taken in different states, then we would have an actual real number. In terms of the population, we would not have certain states misreporting their population, because then they have to pay more in taxes, and they would get more legislative power, because people aren't going to they're not going to pump up their numbers just to get more legislative power if they have to pay more out of their pocket. It is actually a very good system in terms of the way in which they balance it out, but the only problem is certain specific states are going to be different economically than other states, and that's, I think, where they find their issue. I'm not sure specifically. I'm pretty sure there is no provision for direct taxation in states based on population. I'm not 100% sure, but this was, I guess, while they were crafting the Constitution, they were having this debate back and forth. And I know at some time he did mention what I said as the compromise. I'm just trying to find the exact quote, because I must have said it earlier, because I know I have it in here somewhere. I think that's going to be it for this one then, because I can't find it. I have so much written down. But yeah, this one's a pretty harsh one, because you have a lot of talk about slavery, and what the common theme from the left right now, you hear that the government, when it was first proposed, only thought 3/5 a black man was worth 3/5 of a real man. That's actually not the case. The South wanted them to be the people that you're taking the side of, the people that wanted them to be counted as a full person, was the side that was enslaving them, and the North was the side that was saying we shouldn't count them as free persons because you guys don't treat them that way. They should be treated as property, so you guys get taxed the hell out of, and that's how we stop slavery. So you had that common fighting going on. It is actually misrepresented in the news and in the historical context. And all you got to do is you got to read the Federalist Papers, and it's all in there. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe, drop the mic, let people know about the podcast. I greatly appreciate you guys all for tuning in. Make sure you check out my current event podcast. I know this recent weekend was a pretty big one, pretty huge. Some Dr. Fauci stuff on there, making him look like a fraud. And then we have our foreign leaders, our foreign adversaries going after President Biden because they know that he's in a steep cognitive decline. So yeah, just check those out. Some very important news on those, so you know the fight that's coming ahead, that's coming to your door in the near future. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.